Hold on, let me see your ID.
What's going on?
Just give me your ID.
Tell me what you really want.
What are you doing out here?
Waiting on the bus. That's it.
Turn around. I'm gonna pat you down.
For what?
Do what I said. Turn around.
All right.
Officer Evan Kessler walked up like he'd already decided what Malik Grant was doing. A black man near the curb outside a busy bus terminal in downtown Cleveland. And Kessler treated that alone like probable cause. He demanded identification immediately and didn't give a clear lawful reason for the demand. Malik didn't match the energy. He stayed calm, kept his movements controlled, and answered as little as possible because he was protecting an active federal surveillance assignment that couldn't be discussed in public. Right there, the power game started. Kessler wanted compliance first, an explanation later. Malik wanted clarity first, because clarity is what separates a lawful stop from a fishing trip. Before the moment goes further, tell me where you're watching from, city and state. And if you like stories where cameras and procedures expose the truth, hit like and subscribe, because this one turns into a hard lesson in accountability. Now, rewind to the beginning of that curbside moment and how it escalated. The terminal area was busy in the way downtown transit hubs always are. People rotated through constantly. Some were waiting for rides. Some were lining up for buses. Some were just passing through. That kind of environment makes it easy for an officer to claim suspicious without ever pointing to anything specific. And that's exactly where this went. Malik stood near the curb like someone waiting and watching timing. No arguing with anyone. No approaching strangers. No obvious exchange. He looked like a person blending into the normal flow of the terminal. Kessler approached quickly and opened with a demand for ID. He didn't start with a reason Malik could understand and evaluate. He didn't say Malik matched a description. He didn't reference a call for service. He didn't identify a specific behavior he believed was criminal. He simply acted like Malik owed him answers, because Kessler had decided he did. Malik handled it the way trained, careful people handle it when they know they're being pulled into something messy. He kept his voice steady and his body language neutral. He asked whether he was being detained. That question should have been routine. It wasn't. Kessler took it as defiance. He treated basic questions as difficulty, and the tone changed from questioning to control. He repeated the demand for ID with more pressure and started framing Malik's calmness as suspicious. The goal shifted from figuring out what was happening to forcing Malik to submit. A few steps away, a bystander named Janelle Park noticed the way the stop was going and raised her phone. She didn't provoke anything. She didn't step into Kessler's space. She recorded steadily from a safe distance and kept Malik and Kessler in frame. Other people noticed and lifted their phones too, because public stops outside a terminal don't stay private anymore. Kessler saw the phones. He didn't slow down. He moved closer, talked over Malik, and set up the next escalation by implying Malik was uncooperative. Malik stayed controlled and kept his answers minimal. He didn't explain what he was doing there because he couldn't. He wasn't going to expose a federal surveillance assignment in front of a crowd, especially one that was now filming. Kessler switched tactics and announced he was going to pat Malik down. He leaned on the usual officer safety language without pointing to a specific threat. Malik didn't give him a reason to claim fear. He wasn't reaching into pockets. He wasn't making sudden moves. He wasn't clenching fists or taking an aggressive stance. He simply stood there and complied with positioning. The frisk happened in full view of the crowd and multiple phones. Malik stayed still. Kessler worked through the pat-down like he expected to find something because he had already built the story in his head. No weapon appeared. Nothing obvious showed up. That should have ended it. Instead, Kessler acted like the lack of a find was a new problem, not an answer. He started using stop resisting language, even though Malik's body stayed controlled and compliant. That phrase wasn't describing reality. It was shaping a narrative. Janelle's recording captured that mismatch clearly. Kessler saying one thing while Malik's posture showed another. With the crowd watching, Kessler made the choice to escalate again. He moved from frisk to handcuffs. Malik didn't fight. Malik didn't twist away. Malik didn't run. He stayed steady because he understood the stakes. If he reacted emotionally, it would give Kessler the exact justification he was trying to manufacture. Once the cuffs went on, Malik shifted the encounter away from Kessler and toward supervision. He still didn't disclose sensitive details to the crowd. He kept his voice contained and the information limited, but he said enough to force a higher-level response. He identified himself as a federal agent and demanded a supervisor verify credentials properly. That changed the situation instantly, not because Malik was trying to intimidate anyone, but because Kessler could no longer pretend this was a routine stop with a random civilian. A supervisor now had to step in, and the verification would either validate Kessler's actions or expose them in front of witnesses and cameras. Kessler had already committed to the wrong approach, and the evidence was already being recorded from multiple angles. Kessler kept Malik in cuffs like he'd won something. He stayed close, kept talking, and tried to control the crowd with his voice. It didn't work. People didn't move on. Phones stayed up. Janelle Park held her position and kept recording without getting in anyone's way. That steady angle mattered because it showed the full sequence instead of just the loudest moment. Malik didn't give Kessler anything to spin into a threat. His posture stayed neutral. His feet stayed planted. He didn't yank his arms. He didn't argue in circles. He focused on one outcome: get a supervisor here and get the verification done correctly. Kessler tried to keep the interaction at his level. He questioned Malik in the same pushy tone, still acting like Malik owed him explanations. Malik didn't start explaining the assignment, didn't name targets, didn't mention locations, didn't say anything that could compromise what he was doing. He kept it narrow and procedural, repeating that a supervisor needed to verify credentials properly. That's when Kessler made his next mistake. He treated the request for a supervisor like another challenge instead of a normal safeguard. He also kept leaning on the same resisting language, even though Malik's body stayed controlled on camera. You could see it in the crowd's reaction, too. People weren't just watching. They were tracking the mismatch between what Kessler said and what their eyes saw. Backup arrived first, another uniformed officer who took the scene at face value. That officer didn't slow anything down. He stood near Malik, watched Kessler, and followed Kessler's lead the way backups often do when they don't want to question their partner in public. It added pressure without adding clarity. Kessler looked more confident with another badge next to him. He started talking like the stop was already justified, like he didn't need to explain the beginning because he could narrate the middle. That's the trick. If you talk like something is already lawful, a lot of people assume it must be. Malik didn't. He kept the same calm tone, the same limited responses, and the same boundary. Supervisor, verification, and then end this. No public details. A few minutes later, Sergeant Colin Rivera showed up. He didn't come in loud. He didn't rush into Kessler's version of events. He looked at Malik in cuffs, looked at the crowd, looked at the phones, and immediately understood what kind of scene this was turning into. Rivera separated the problem before he separated the people. He pulled Kessler aside a few steps and told him to hold position. Rivera didn't do it to embarrass him. He did it to stop the momentum. Kessler had been driving the whole interaction, and Rivera needed the temperature to drop. Then Rivera walked over to Malik and spoke directly, in a controlled, professional way. He didn't demand a speech. He didn't make it a public interrogation. He kept it procedural. Malik gave the minimum necessary to trigger proper verification. He didn't announce anything to the crowd beyond what was required. He made it clear he had credentials and that they needed to be verified the correct way, through the right channels, not through curbside guessing. Rivera took that seriously. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't treat it as an insult. He treated it like a job requirement. Verification didn't happen the way Kessler wanted, which was the whole point. Rivera didn't ask Malik to explain his work in front of strangers. He didn't ask for sensitive details out loud. He stepped away and handled it through procedure, using secure contact methods and proper identification checks. He also kept Kessler away from the process, so there was no pressure and no contamination. While Rivera verified, the crowd stayed quiet but focused. People could tell the energy had shifted. This wasn't Kessler performing control anymore. This was supervision taking the wheel. Kessler, meanwhile, tried to stay composed, but the posture gave him away. He kept watching Rivera, watching Malik, and watching the phones. He couldn't control the narrative anymore, and he knew it. Rivera came back with a different face than Kessler expected. Not confused, not doubtful. Certain. He told Kessler clearly and directly that the credentials checked out and the cuffs had to come off. No debate, no extra lecture in front of everyone. Simple order. Kessler hesitated. That hesitation became its own moment because it showed the conflict wasn't about safety. It was about ego. The crowd saw it. Janelle's camera saw it. Malik saw it. Rivera repeated the order. Kessler removed the handcuffs in front of the crowd, and it happened with multiple phones locked on his hands. Rivera didn't let it be hidden behind a car door or turn into a private correction. It stayed public because the mistake was public. Malik rubbed his wrists once and didn't celebrate. No speeches, no yelling, no victory lap. He just looked at Rivera and kept it professional. Rivera addressed Malik briefly, keeping it controlled, and then shifted to Kessler. He didn't scream at him. He didn't act like a tough guy. He spoke like a supervisor who understood liability and understood standards. Then Rivera did one more thing that mattered. He separated Malik from the crowd and the officers and gave him space to reset without being surrounded. That protected Malik's safety and protected the integrity of whatever he had been working on. Kessler didn't get arrested. He didn't get slammed into a car. Real life doesn't work like that. What he got was worse for a cop like him. A public correction on multiple recordings, with his own behavior clearly documented from the first demand to the final removal of cuffs. And Malik left the terminal area with his assignment disrupted, his identity exposed more than it should have been, and the certainty that Kessler was going to write a report that didn't match what the cameras captured. Kessler didn't treat what happened as a mistake. He treated it like a story he could rewrite on paper. By the end of his shift, he wrote a report that tried to justify the stop from the beginning. He didn't frame it as walking up and demanding ID without a clear reason. He framed it like he observed suspicious behavior first, then made a reasonable decision to investigate, then lawfully detain Malik based on escalating concerns. That's the move. Start the report with certainty, and readers who weren't there might assume the certainty came from facts. The problem was that this time, the facts came with timestamps. Malik documented the operational disruption immediately, not emotionally, logistically. He described how the stop exposed him in public, pulled attention to his presence, delayed his timeline, and forced him to reveal credentials in a setting where he had no control over who was recording. That disruption mattered because it wasn't just embarrassment. It created measurable risk to an active surveillance assignment. Janelle Park uploaded her video that night, not with a dramatic caption, just a clean description of what she filmed. Other angles surfaced too, including a second bystander video that caught Kessler's first approach and the initial ID demand clearly. Then the Bodycam footage got pulled. That's where Kessler lost control completely, because Bodycam doesn't care about how a report is written. It cares about sequence. The timeline was simple. Kessler approached. Immediate ID demand. No clear lawful reason stated. Malik asked whether he was detained. Kessler treated the question like a problem. The stop escalated from questions to frisk to cuffs. Stop resisting language appeared while Malik stayed controlled. Malik requested supervision and proper verification. Rivera arrived, separated parties, verified credentials correctly, and ordered cuffs removed in front of the crowd. No gaps, no mystery behavior in between. No hidden threat, No sudden move that forced Kessler's hand. When Internal Affairs compared the report to the footage, the inconsistencies weren't minor. The report described justification that didn't appear at the start of the video. The report implied resistance that the video didn't show. The report framed the detention as a response to Malik's conduct, while the footage showed Kessler escalating because Malik asked basic questions. That's when the investigation stopped being about a single curbside stop and turned into a credibility issue. Internal Affairs opened a formal case, not a coaching conversation. A real case with evidence review, interviews, and report integrity on the line. Then the city got outside legal pressure fast because Malik didn't handle this like a regular complainant. He had agency backing, documentation discipline, and a clear operational impact statement. An outside civil rights review got involved. That wasn't just for optics. It was because the evidence was clean, the crowd footage was public, and the report Bodycam mismatch raised a bigger question. If Kessler was willing to write around one video, how many other stops had he written around when there was no video? That review team requested Kessler's stop history. Not just arrests, stops, field interviews, Terry stops, ID demands, frisk frequency, complaint patterns, body cam activation patterns, report language patterns. And the pattern didn't look good. It wasn't one smoking gun. It was repetition. Stops clustered around the same areas. The same vague high crime framing. The same phrasing that turned normal behavior into suspicious indicators. The same escalation ladder where questions became non-compliance. The same stop resisting language showing up early in confrontations. A disproportionate number of black men stopped compared to other groups in similar contexts, based on the department's own records. Internal Affairs interviewed Kessler. He stuck to his report version. He described Malik's questions as evasive. He claimed Malik's posture made him fear a weapon. He emphasized officer safety and training. That didn't fix the problem. It made it worse because it forced IA to make a choice. Accept the paper narrative or accept what the cameras showed. Cameras usually win when they're this clear. Rivera's role became important too. Supervisors don't just correct scenes, they create records. Rivera documented how verification was done, why it was done that way, and why the cuffs came off. Rivera didn't attack Kessler in writing. He simply described procedure and outcome. That created a second official account that aligned with the video, not with Kessler's report. By the time city attorneys reviewed the evidence, they weren't just looking at a bad stop. They were looking at exposure, bystander video plus body cam, public crowd, a federal agent on an active assignment, a report that didn't match reality, a supervisor who corrected the scene, a stop history pattern that suggested this wasn't rare behavior. That's not a case you explain away. That's a case you either fight and lose publicly or you settle and try to contain damage. And Kessler still had one last problem he couldn't talk his way out of. The words he used on scene. The early stop resisting language. The way he treated basic rights questions like disrespect. The way he escalated before he established a lawful reason. Janelle's footage made it easy for regular people to understand, and that's the most dangerous kind of evidence for a department. You didn't need a law degree to see what happened. All of it set up the final phase. Discipline, civil payout negotiations, and policy fallout. Once Internal Affairs and the outside Civil Rights Review had the footage lined up against Kessler's report, the city's options got limited fast. This wasn't a case where the facts were unclear. The sequence was clean. The recordings showed the first demand, the lack of a clear, lawful reason stated, the escalation when Malik asked basic detention questions, and the jump to cuffs with stop resisting language that didn't match Malik's controlled behavior. City attorneys don't like cases where a jury can understand the problem in the first 30 seconds. Malik's side didn't argue this like it was a personal insult. They argued it like an operational disruption with civil rights violations attached. They documented time loss, exposure risk, mission interruption, and the forced disclosure of credentials in public. They also pointed out something the public always notices. Kessler didn't slow down when cameras came out. He sped up. That detail matters in court. It suggests he wasn't confused. He was committed. The outside reviewers didn't just focus on this stop. They put Kessler's history next to it. Same types of locations, similar vague language in reports, similar escalation patterns. Complaints that didn't go anywhere until there was video. Once the reviewers showed the city that the stop wasn't an isolated lapse, settlement talks stopped being hypothetical. The city settled for $4 million. That number wasn't only about Malik. It was also about risk management. The city was paying to avoid trial testimony, avoid long discovery, avoid public release of even more stop data, and avoid a courtroom replay of Bodycam footage next to a report that didn't match it. Then discipline hit. Kessler didn't get reassigned quietly. He got terminated. The report inconsistency played a huge role because departments can defend bad judgment more easily than they can defend writing a false narrative after the fact. Once a cop's credibility collapses, everything they touch becomes a problem. Arrests, testimony, past cases. A city doesn't keep that liability around unless it wants more lawsuits. The department also knew the public had recordings from multiple angles. It wasn't just body cam. It was Janelle Park's video, plus other bystanders, plus crowd audio reacting in real time. That made it impossible to frame the outcome as misunderstanding without looking dishonest. After the settlement and the termination, the department rolled out changes they could point to in public and enforce internally. They tightened reasonable suspicion documentation so officers couldn't skip the why and jump straight to demands. They expanded stop data audits so patterns like Kessler's didn't hide in plain sight for years. They also started stricter enforcement on body cam and report consistency, because the easiest way to poison trust is letting officers write reports that don't match what the cameras show. Those changes weren't magic. Policy never fixes everything. But it did one thing the system often avoids. It admitted that vague suspicion plus ego can turn a curbside interaction into a civil rights violation in minutes. And Malik, he didn't become a celebrity. He didn't go on a victory tour. He went back to work. He also left that scene with a clear outcome. He stayed calm, protected sensitive details in public, forced the situation into supervision, and let verification do the talking. He didn't win because he yelled louder. He won because he stayed precise, while Kessler got sloppy on camera. Now here's the question for you. If you were standing in that crowd, and you saw a calm person getting escalated on without a clear reason, phones coming up, an officer getting louder, stop resisting being said, while the person stayed controlled, what would you do? Would you record? Would you speak up? Would you keep your distance and still document? Drop it in the comments, because how bystanders move in moments like that changes outcomes. If you want more stories like this, realistic situations, clean timelines, and accountability that actually lands, like the video, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see how fast a routine stop can turn into a lawsuit when an officer skips the law.
IDs, both of you, now.
Before we give you anything, what's the legal reason you're
This is a
demanding
high-end
ID?
property. We got security concerns. Just cooperate and it ends.
Are we being detained or is this a request?
You're sitting here like you're casing the place.
What behavior made you say that?
Loitering, trespassing. I can make things
Officer Dylan Carter walked into that upscale hotel lobby thinking he was dealing with two people he could intimidate out of the room. He'd already decided Malcolm and Talia Hart didn't belong there, and he acted like his opinion was enough to turn a lounge chair into a crime scene. He approached them in the lobby lounge and pressed for identification right away. He didn't clearly explain why. No specific complaint. No stated call. No clear, lawful basis. Malcolm stayed seated. He kept his voice even. He asked what the legal reason was for the ID demand. Carter didn't answer cleanly. He talked around it, leaning on vague security language. and the idea that the hotel wanted them checked out. He repeated the request, like repetition could replace justification. Malcolm didn't argue. He asked again, more precisely, whether Carter was detaining them or making a request. He asked what crime, if any, Carter believed was happening. Talia stayed quiet and watched closely. She wasn't making faces. She wasn't escalating. She simply understood where this kind of encounter could go. So she started recording audio without announcing it. Carter's tone tightened once he realized they weren't going to hand over ID just because he asked. He framed their calm questions as making it difficult. He started implying that refusing to comply was suspicious on its own. Malcolm kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. He asked what facts Carter had, not what he assumed. He asked whether Carter had reasonable suspicion tied to something specific they did, not how they looked sitting in a hotel lounge. Carter shifted tactics and suggested they might be casing the property. Nothing in the scene supported that. They weren't walking the halls, they weren't checking doors, they weren't moving around taking notes. They were sitting, calm, quiet. Malcolm asked Carter what behavior made him say that. Carter didn't give a clear answer. He moved to threats instead. He brought up loitering and trespassing. That was another jump. Hotels can trespass people, sure, but Carter still wasn't stating that hotel management had actually asked for them to be removed, or that the couple had been told to leave. He was using those words to create pressure. Malcolm didn't flinch. He asked if the hotel had issued a trespass warning. He asked if management was present to confirm they were not allowed to be there. Carter's frustration showed in how he escalated again. He reached for the most damaging label he could throw into the situation without having to prove anything in that moment. He radioed out possible narcotics involvement. No concrete signs of drugs were visible. No clear indicators were described. No specific observation was offered. He still put it on the air. That kind of broadcast changes how other officers approach. It changes how staff and bystanders interpret what they're seeing. It also creates a record that can be reviewed later. Malcolm focused on that immediately. He asked what prompted the narcotics claim. Carter didn't give a factual explanation. He tried to pull the conversation back to ID and compliance. Talia stayed steady and kept recording. She didn't challenge Carter emotionally. She let him talk because she understood that a clean record mattered more than winning a verbal exchange. Carter called for another unit. A few minutes later, Officer Sophia Reyes arrived. Her approach looked different from the start. She didn't walk in assuming Carter was right. She scanned the scene and took a moment to understand what was happening. Malcolm and Talia were seated and calm. Carter was the one driving the tension. Reyes asked Carter what crime he was investigating. Carter tried to justify the stop with general statements about the property and suspicion. He referenced casing. He referenced his narcotics comment as if it was already supported. Reyes pressed for specifics. She asked what he saw. She asked what was reported. She asked what facts existed right now that justified detaining two people in a hotel lounge. Then she addressed the narcotics escalation directly. She challenged it on the record and questioned why it had been broadcast without clear indicators. That question mattered because it forced Carter to either provide real facts or admit he didn't have them. Malcolm and Talia stayed calm through all of it. They didn't take victory laps. They didn't taunt. They let Reyes do what a professional officer should do, separate assumptions from evidence. And at that point, Carter was boxed in. He'd escalated publicly. He'd put narcotics into radio traffic. He'd pressured for ID without a clearly stated lawful basis. Now, another officer was asking him in real time to explain himself. Reyes didn't let Carter steer the situation with labels. She kept pulling it back to basics. What was observed? What was reported? What law applied? Carter kept answering like he was trying to win an argument instead of explaining a detention. Carter pointed to the hotel environment and implied the couple didn't belong. He leaned on suspicious presence and the refusal to hand over ID, as if that refusal created probable cause by itself. Reyes didn't accept that. She asked whether the hotel had actually requested a trespass warning or removal. Staff stood nearby, watching and saying as little as possible. Nobody stepped forward with a clear statement that Malcolm and Talia had been told to leave and refused. Carter tried again with loitering. Reyes pressed him to identify what specific ordinance he was relying on and what conduct met the elements. Carter couldn't tighten it up because there wasn't conduct to point to. Two people sitting quietly in a lobby lounge didn't magically become a crime because they didn't satisfy his curiosity. Then Reyes circled back to the radio traffic. She asked what objective indicators justified the narcotics mention. Carter gave a vague explanation that sounded more like a hunch than an observation. Reyes corrected that direction right away, because she understood what that kind of escalation does. It invites a higher risk response from everyone who hears it. Malcolm stayed composed and kept his tone respectful. He asked if he was free to leave. Carter didn't give a direct yes. He kept trying to keep them pinned in place without calling it a detention. That's when Talia finally spoke more. She kept it minimal and controlled. She asked Carter to confirm whether he was ordering them to remain or whether they could simply end the interaction. Carter doubled down. He claimed he needed identification to clear it up. He tried to make it sound like cooperation was the only reasonable outcome, and anything else meant guilt. Reyes didn't back him up. She kept asking for the legal basis. She also made it clear she wanted his facts straight, because she wasn't going to attach her name to a report built on guesswork. The lounge had gone quiet in that specific way public spaces get when everyone pretends they aren't listening while they listen to everything. A few guests glanced over and looked away. Staff hovered like they wanted the scene to end, but didn't want to contradict an officer either. Malcolm and Talia held their ground without making it personal. They didn't debate race out loud. They didn't insult Carter. They didn't raise their voices. They stayed in the lane that always hurts the most when the stop is weak: rules, definitions, and documented reasons. After several rounds of Carter trying to compel ID without stating a lawful reason, Malcolm and Talia made a decision. Not because they had to, because they could end the street theater and force the encounter into a proper lane. Malcolm produced federal credentials. Carter's posture changed immediately. His voice softened. He started using sir and ma'am energy. The same officer who had been talking about loitering and narcotics now looked like he wanted the last 10 minutes to disappear. Talia produced hers right after. The shift hit even harder because it made the earlier "you don't fit here" assumption look exactly like what it was. Reyes looked at the credentials, then looked back at Carter. Her expression didn't turn dramatic. It turned disappointed. She asked him again what facts he had before he escalated the encounter and broadcast narcotics over the radio. Carter tried to recover with polite explanations. He framed it as a misunderstanding and suggested he was just doing his job. The problem was the record. The radio traffic existed. The body cameras existed. Talia's audio existed. His words were already out there. Reyes told Carter a supervisor needed to be notified. Carter didn't argue that point. He wanted a supervisor now because he needed someone higher up to help manage what he'd started. A supervisor was called to the lobby. While they waited, Malcolm and Talia stayed calm and professional. They didn't threaten. They didn't make a scene. Malcolm explained in a measured way that they were willing to provide a full account through proper documentation, and that they had an audio recording of the interaction from early on. That detail landed hard, because it meant this couldn't be smoothed over with a vague report later. Reyes acknowledged it and made it clear in front of Carter that the recording should be submitted through the right process. She also kept the conversation tight to facts. When Carter approached, what he said, what he claimed, and what he put on the radio. Carter tried to regain control by acting cooperative. He asked for the credentials again, like rechecking them could reset the timeline. It didn't. The supervisor arrived with that controlled, careful demeanor supervisors get when they sense liability. They spoke with Malcolm and Talia respectfully, asked for a basic summary, and then turned to Carter for his version. Carter's version suddenly became smaller, less confident, less accusatory. The narcotics angle faded fast. The casing claim softened into concerns. The loitering and trespass talk became confusion. The supervisor asked what specific observations justified the narcotics broadcast. Carter didn't give anything concrete. Malcolm and Talia told the supervisor they would provide the complete recording along with a written statement through the correct channels, and they wanted all relevant records preserved. That included body camera footage and radio traffic. The supervisor acknowledged that request and said the incident would be reviewed. By the next morning, the incident wasn't just something that happened in a hotel lobby. It had a paper trail. Multiple trails, actually. Malcolm and Talia handled it the same way they handled Carter in person, calm, organized, and specific. They documented the timeline while it was fresh. Time they entered, where they sat, when Carter approached, when he demanded ID, when he implied casing, when he threatened loitering and trespass, the exact moment he broadcast possible narcotics involvement, the moment Reyes arrived and started questioning the facts, the credential reveal, the supervisor call. Then they packaged the audio properly. Not a dramatic social media upload, not an emotional post. They treated it like evidence because that's what it was. They prepared a written statement and referenced the existence of the recording, offering the full file through the department's complaint process and any investigator assigned. They also did something most people forget. They requested preservation. They asked for body camera footage from Carter and Reyes, dispatch recordings, and radio traffic logs tied to the event. They didn't ask casually. They used precise language that made it clear they expected the department to retain those records. At the same time, the hotel had its own internal reaction. The lounge manager and front desk staff had been present for part of the encounter. Even if nobody wanted to get in the middle of it at the time, the hotel still had cameras, internal notes, and an interest in avoiding a public scandal. Their security and management team pulled their own incident report because a police escalation in a lobby lounge doesn't look good for anyone involved. Carter had also created another problem for himself. He'd pulled other people into his story. That narcotics broadcast didn't just sit in his radio mic. It traveled. Dispatch heard it. Any unit monitoring the channel heard it. Supervisors could hear it later. That meant the department had more than a he said, she said. They had his own words in an official stream. Reyes's involvement mattered here too. She wasn't just a witness. She was a participant who questioned Carter's basis in real time. Her body camera would capture her asking for the underlying facts and challenging the narcotics angle. That isn't a small detail. It separates two civilians complaining from another officer flagged this as it happened. As the complaint moved forward, the response from the department got noticeably fast and careful. You could see why. The allegation wasn't just rudeness. It was escalation without lawful basis, pressure for identification without clear justification, and inaccurate or unsupported radio reporting that implied narcotics involvement. Those aren't tone issues. Those are policy and liability issues. Investigators requested the audio. Malcolm and Talia provided it through the proper channel, with a clear chain of custody. They also provided their written statement, and they asked for confirmation of receipt. On the department side, the internal review started collecting the obvious pieces. Body camera footage from Carter, body camera footage from Reyes, dispatch and radio traffic recordings, any CAD notes tied to the call or self-initiated contact, supervisors' notes from the lobby, hotel camera footage were available. Statements from staff. If the hotel cooperated, Carter, meanwhile, had to write his report and explain his decisions. That's where weak stops collapse. Reports force specifics. They force you to commit to what you claim you saw and why it mattered. Vague language becomes risky because it's easy to compare against Bodycam and radio audio. If Carter minimized the narcotics broadcast, the radio log would contradict him. If he claimed specific drug indicators, body camera footage would get checked for those indicators. If he leaned on trespass, investigators would ask who authorized it and when. If he leaned on loitering, they'd look for the elements of the offense and whether any warning or request to leave happened first. The department also had to consider Reyes's unseen actions. Her questions weren't just interpersonal disagreement. They were on-record challenges to the justification. That gave internal investigators a clear reference point. Another officer heard the same situation and didn't see the factual basis, Carter claimed. Within days, the tone from the department shifted into formal mode. A case number, an assigned investigator, request for supplemental information, confirmation that evidence was being reviewed. It wasn't friendly, it was careful. The kind of careful that happens when decision makers already suspect the audio is bad. Malcolm and Talia stayed consistent. They didn't chase attention. They didn't do interviews. They didn't need to. They kept everything inside the system that creates consequences: documentation, records, and policy review. And while that was happening, Carter's choices kept compounding. Because every escalation he made in that lobby had created another checkpoint for investigators to test. Internal Affairs didn't have to guess what happened in that lounge. They had Carter's own radio traffic. They had body camera footage. They had Reyes on camera asking him what crime he was investigating. They had Malcolm and Talia's audio starting early, before anyone could claim the recording only captured the end. When investigators lined it all up, Carter's timeline didn't hold. The review focused on a few basic questions that always decide these cases. Did Carter have a lawful reason to pressure two people for identification in a hotel lounge? Did he clearly state a legal basis for a detention? Or did he try to trap them in a detention without naming it? Did he escalate from vague suspicion into threats like loitering and trespass without the necessary steps and facts? Did he broadcast possible narcotics involvement based on real indicators? Or did he throw that label out to justify his own posture and bring backup in hotter? That last one mattered the most, because it wasn't just attitude. It was inaccurate reporting over official channels tied to a serious accusation with no concrete signs documented in the moment. Reyes's involvement kept showing up in the investigation for one simple reason. She asked the same questions Malcolm and Talia asked, on the record, as an officer. She didn't treat Carter's assumptions like facts. She treated them like claims that needed support. Investigators pulled dispatch audio and radio logs. Carter's narcotics broadcast was there, clear as day. Then they checked what followed. There was no discovery, no search, no substance, no articulable observation that matched the escalation. They reviewed body cam from Carter. His initial approach showed the same pattern the couple described. Pressure first, explanation later. He didn't open with a clear, lawful basis. He opened with control. They reviewed Reyes's body cam. She arrived and immediately challenged the foundation of the stop. She questioned the narcotics mention. She asked what crime was being investigated. That created a clean checkpoint in the footage where Carter had to justify himself and couldn't. They reviewed the supervisor's response. The supervisor's questions were practical and direct. Why narcotics? Why ID? What facts? Carter didn't give solid answers then either. Then the department compared Carter's written reporting to all of that. If he wrote it vaguely, the footage exposed the gaps. If he wrote it confidently, the audio exposed the inaccuracies. That's how this moved from complaint to sustained. The department concluded Carter violated policy tied to unlawful escalation and inaccurate reporting. The finding didn't hinge on one sentence. It was the whole chain. approaching without a clear basis, pressuring for ID, stacking threats, then amplifying the situation through the narcotics broadcasts without supporting facts. Carter lost his job. And it wasn't framed as a quiet, mutual separation. The department cited policy violations connected to the escalation and the reporting, the kind of language departments use when they know the record would be ugly in court. Malcolm and Talia didn't treat it like a victory lap. They treated it like confirmation that their approach worked. They stayed calm during the stop. They didn't match Carter's energy. They asked precise questions. Talia recorded early and quietly. They offered the recording through the proper process instead of trying to win the internet. They requested preservation. They made the department deal with the facts. That's why it moved. This incident also created internal ripples. Supervisors don't like officers who turn nothing into a liability. Training reminders and roll call briefings typically follow cases like this, because leadership wants fewer self-initiated stops based on vibes and fewer radio escalations that can't be defended later. Reyes came out of it looking like what backup is supposed to be. Not a hype squad, not a second bully, a professional who checks the facts and refuses to help build a fake narrative. And if you're watching this wondering what you would have done, here's the reality. Most people fold because they think compliance will end it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it invites more. The Hearts didn't win because they got loud. They won because they stayed controlled, asked the right questions, and kept a record. So let me ask you straight. If an officer demanded your ID without explaining a lawful reason, would you hand it over just to make it go away? Or would you ask what you're being detained for? Drop your answer in the comments and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Okay, stop right there. Don't move. Hands where I can see them.
I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Marcus Reed. I'm traveling on official orders.
That uniform doesn't mean anything to me. Show me something real.
I can give you my credentials and orders.
Put the bag down.
Please verify through dispatch or a supervisor.
You're detained.
Officer Ethan Crowley believed he was dealing with a fake, another guy trying to look important in a busy airport. He figured it would be simple. Stop him, check him, search his bag, prove he didn't belong, and send him on his way embarrassed. What Crowley didn't understand was that the man standing in front of him wasn't pretending to be law enforcement. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal on official orders, and the moment Crowley decided to escalate, he turned a routine contact into a recorded civil rights incident. Before we rewind, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you like stories where arrogance meets documentation and accountability, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with consequences. This started inside Denver International Airport during a stretch of heavy foot traffic where people were rushing between gates and nobody had patience for delays. Crowley and his partner, Officer Kyle Benton, were working patrol in the terminal. They weren't at a checkpoint. This was the public side of the airport, where officers rely on discretion, quick judgments, and constant scanning for anything that looks off. Marcus Reed didn't look off. He looked official. Reed moved through the terminal in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform, carrying a travel bag and paperwork for an official assignment. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't looking for attention. He had the posture of someone used to airports, used to procedures, and used to getting from one point to the next without drama. Crowley stepped into his path and stopped him anyway. Crowley demanded Reed's identification and immediately treated the uniform as suspicious. Instead of asking routine verification questions, he framed it like an accusation. Reed responded the way trained federal officers do in public. Calm tone, controlled movements, hands visible, credentials presented without arguing. Crowley didn't accept what he was looking at. Reed provided his marshal credentials and travel documentation and indicated he was traveling under official orders. The simple next step was obvious. Confirm through proper channels, call a supervisor, verify the credentials, and let him continue. Reed's demeanor made it easier, not harder. He didn't posture, He didn't get loud. He kept it professional. Crowley pushed harder. He demanded Reed's bag and insisted on searching it right there. Reed didn't refuse in a confrontational way, but he didn't surrender his rights or the process either. He kept offering the clean, standard solution: verify his identity through dispatch and a supervisor, then handle any necessary checks the right way. Crowley took that as resistance. Benton stayed close beside Crowley. He didn't calm the situation down. He didn't step in with a moderating voice. He backed Crowley's body language and let Crowley drive the contact. People around them started watching. Airports have a lot of noise, but tension stands out. A uniformed man being pressed by two officers catches attention fast. Travelers slowed down. Someone pulled out a phone. Then another person did the same from a different angle. Crowley had body cameras. Reed had paperwork. The public had cameras too. Crowley kept talking as if Reed's credentials were a prop. The comments turned from suspicion into something uglier. He implied Reed didn't match what a real marshal should be. He suggested the uniform was stolen or fake. The tone carried that familiar message without needing a speech. Crowley wasn't evaluating evidence. He was evaluating whether Reed looked like he belonged in the role. Reed stayed steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden moves. He didn't give Crowley any excuse to claim he felt threatened. He kept his hands visible and his responses brief. That kind of self-control doesn't come from being timid. It comes from knowing how quickly a situation can be rewritten if you give the wrong person an opening. Crowley escalated anyway. He announced he was detaining Reed and moved in as if Reed had done something dangerous. Reed complied. No swinging arms, no pulling away, no attempt to run. Compliance didn't slow Crowley down. Crowley forced Reed to the ground in front of the crowd and put him in handcuffs while bystanders recorded and his body camera captured everything. Reed stayed on the floor, controlled and silent, waiting for the only thing that mattered now: verification through someone who would actually look at facts. That's when Sergeant Alicia Moreno arrived. Sergeant Alicia Moreno walked up into a scene that already looked bad from a distance. A man in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform was on the floor in handcuffs. Two airport officers were standing over him like they'd just stopped a threat. People had formed a loose ring around the situation, and several phones were up recording. Moreno didn't waste time trying to look tough. She went straight to information. Crowley started talking immediately, trying to control the story. He framed Reed like an imposter, acted like the stop had been justified, and tried to make Reed's calm compliance sound suspicious. Benton stood with him, backing the posture, letting Crowley narrate. Moreno focused on Reed. Reed kept the same controlled demeanor. He indicated he had already provided credentials and travel documentation and had asked for proper verification. He didn't plead. He didn't perform. He stayed professional because he knew the first supervisor who actually checked facts would end this. Moreno requested Reed's marshal credentials and orders. Within seconds, the difference between suspicion and reality became obvious. The identification was legitimate. The documentation matched. The travel orders checked out. Reed wasn't a civilian with a costume. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal traveling on official business, exactly as he had said from the start. Moreno's tone shifted from manage a situation to stop a mistake. She ordered Reed uncuffed immediately. Crowley hesitated. Not because he lacked the ability to follow instructions, but because uncuffing Reed meant admitting the whole contact had been wrong. Moreno didn't give him room to negotiate. She repeated the order and directed the removal of the cuffs right there in front of the crowd that had watched the takedown. Reed got up slowly and deliberately. No sudden movements, no gestures, just dignity. Moreno separated the officers from Reed and kept the contact controlled. She asked quick questions, confirmed the timeline, and made it clear she wasn't accepting vague officer safety explanations after the fact. Crowley tried to justify the escalation. Moreno didn't argue with him in public. She treated it like what it was: a supervisor securing the scene, gathering basic facts, and preventing further damage. Reed stayed composed. and did what most people don't even think to do in the moment. He documented. He requested that all recordings be preserved, including body camera footage, airport surveillance, and any officer reports generated. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear that the record mattered and that he expected it to be handled correctly. That request landed differently because of who he was. Reed wasn't guessing at policy. He lived inside procedure. Moreno called for higher command. Chief Daniel Hartman responded after the initial verification came back. By the time he arrived, the crowd had thinned, but the phones had already captured enough. Hartman didn't treat it like a misunderstanding to smooth over. He treated it like an operational failure with legal consequences. Hartman spoke with Moreno first, then with Reed. Reed provided his credentials again and the travel documentation, and Hartman confirmed what Moreno had already established. Reed's identity was legitimate, his orders were legitimate, and the detention had no reasonable basis once credentials were presented. Hartman's next steps were immediate and administrative, not emotional. He pulled Crowley and Benton off duty on the spot. He directed that all body camera footage be preserved without delay. He instructed supervisors to secure any airport surveillance that captured the incident. He ordered that no one involved write creative summaries after the fact. Reports would be written, but the footage would be the anchor. Crowley tried to push back, not loudly, but in the way officers sometimes do when they realize they're about to lose control of the narrative. Hartman shut it down. Crowley and Benton were done for the day. Reed didn't celebrate. He didn't make a scene. He didn't have to. He left with his dignity intact. But the damage was already real. He'd been taken to the floor and cuffed in public while wearing a federal uniform. And the reason wasn't confusion. It was assumption. People had watched it happen. Cameras had captured it. That kind of moment doesn't disappear when the cuffs come off. Over the next hours, the incident didn't stay inside the terminal. Bystander videos started circulating. The body camera footage was now evidence. Hartman's decision to preserve everything meant this wouldn't turn into a he said, she said. It would turn into a review of what happened, what was said, and why two officers felt comfortable treating a confirmed federal officer like a suspect. Internal Affairs was triggered almost immediately because it had to be. A public takedown with questionable justification, racially loaded remarks on camera, and a detained deputy U.S. Marshal creates a tension that local leadership can't contain. And that attention didn't stop at the airport department. Federal scrutiny followed because Reed wasn't just any traveler. He was part of a federal law enforcement agency with its own standards, its own legal teams, and its own expectations when one of its people gets treated like that. By the time the first formal requests for records and footage started landing, Crowley and Benton weren't dealing with a complaint from a random passenger. They were dealing with a documented incident involving a federal officer, multiple recordings, a supervisor who verified legitimacy on scene, and a chief who had already locked down the evidence trail. That's where the real consequences began. Internal Affairs opened the case the same day, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. A takedown in public is already serious. A takedown of a verified federal officer, while comments on camera suggested bias, turns into a liability fire on multiple levels. Chief Daniel Hartman didn't wait for someone else to force his hand. He issued a preservation order for everything tied to the incident. Both body cameras, dispatch audio, written logs, and the airport's fixed surveillance feeds. He also ordered Crowley and Benton to submit their initial statements separately. No hallway coaching. No, let's get our stories straight. That detail mattered. Separation prevents teamwork from turning into narrative building. Crowley's first statement tried to lean on the usual cover language: safety, uncertainty, suspicious behavior. The problem was simple. The footage didn't support it. Reed's posture stayed controlled. His hands stayed visible. He produced credentials early. He repeatedly offered a clean verification process. The video captured it. Benton's statement was worse in a different way. He didn't own the escalation, but he also didn't distance himself from it. He stayed in the pocket with Crowley the entire time. He helped maintain the detention. He didn't intervene when Crowley's remarks crossed into racial assumptions. That kind of silence becomes its own action when you're wearing a badge. Investigators moved fast because they knew how these cases age. Memory gets convenient, reports get polished, footage stays blunt. They interviewed Moreno first. Moreno confirmed what she saw and what she verified. Reed's marshal credentials and travel documentation checked out immediately, and nothing about Reed's behavior justified forcing him to the floor once credentials were presented. Moreno also documented the crowd presence and confirmed that multiple civilians were recording before she arrived. Then Internal Affairs interviewed Reed. Reed didn't show up emotional. He showed up prepared. He gave a timeline, listed who said what, and identified the exact moment the stop shifted from verification to humiliation. He also provided his official orders and noted the agency contacts who could confirm them. That wasn't posturing. That was Reed making sure the investigation couldn't be steered into vagueness. The federal side didn't wait around either. Once Reed's agency learned what happened, they requested the preserved footage and incident records through formal channels. They also requested any prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, including use of force history and bias-related allegations. That's standard when an event suggests a pattern. The department couldn't stall without making it worse. Hartman had already locked the evidence down, so the requests were processed. As the footage got reviewed, the case stopped being about a misunderstanding. The recordings showed how the assumptions formed, how the tone shifted, and how Crowley escalated after being offered verification. The remarks didn't land as accidental. They landed as worldview. That's why they hit so hard when replayed in a quiet room with investigators. Crowley tried to reframe it as instincts. He claimed he couldn't trust credentials on site. He suggested criminals impersonate officers. He tried to make it sound like he'd been doing the public a favor. Internal Affairs pushed back with the obvious questions. If the concern was impersonation, why reject the offer to verify through dispatch and a supervisor? Why escalate to a takedown with a compliant subject? Why make comments about Reed not matching the role instead of focusing on verification? Why continue after the credentials were presented? The answers didn't come out clean. And by then, the public side was moving too. Bystander videos were spreading. People were tagging the airport department. Comment sections filled up with the same pattern. People saying they'd experienced similar treatment. People arguing about authority. People focusing on the fact that Reed didn't do anything aggressive and still ended up on the floor. That pressure didn't decide the investigation, but it raised the cost of a quiet cover-up. Internal Affairs completed an early findings memo, and it didn't read like a minor policy issue. It read like a failure of judgment, a failure of procedure, and a failure to intervene. Crowley faced the main charge, unreasonable detention and use of force, plus conduct violations tied to the recorded remarks. The department also flagged credibility issues because once an officer's explanations don't match the footage, the damage goes beyond one incident. Courts remember that. Benton faced a different lane: failure to intervene, failure to de-escalate, and failure to report misconduct appropriately. He didn't throw Reed to the ground, but he stood there and helped keep the cuffs on. He watched the train coming and stayed on the tracks. Hartman placed both officers on formal administrative status while the process moved forward. Crowley was already off the street. Benton was too. No back next week. No quiet reassignment to a softer post. Behind the scenes, city attorneys and department counsel got involved because they had to. This wasn't going to be handled with a stern talk and a training reminder. The footage had legal weight, and Reed's career and reputation had been attacked in public. Reed's next move was predictable for someone who understood accountability systems. He retained counsel and filed a civil rights lawsuit alleging unlawful detention, excessive force, and discriminatory treatment. The filing didn't depend on emotion. It depended on evidence, and the evidence was already stacked. Bodycam, bystander video, supervisor verification, chief's preservation order, and internal findings pointing in the same direction. Once the lawsuit hit, Crowley's employment situation became a countdown. Departments can survive accusations. They don't survive footage that contradicts their officer, especially when federal scrutiny is in the mix. Crowley fought it anyway. He appealed internally. He leaned on union representation. He tried to argue procedure. None of it changed what the cameras showed. The department terminated Crowley. After termination, the state-level certification process followed. Decertification isn't a headline word to most people, but inside law enforcement, it's a career ender. It blocks the easy move to another department. It marks you as unfit to serve. Benton didn't get fired, but he didn't walk away clean. The department disciplined him for failing to intervene and for backing an escalation that should have been stopped. His record took the hit, his standing dropped, and his role changed. The message was clear. Being the quiet partner doesn't protect you when you enable misconduct on camera. By the time those employment decisions landed, the lawsuit was already pushing towards the part departments hate most, discovery. Because discovery doesn't care about anyone's pride. It demands documents, training records, prior complaints, and communications. It drags patterns into daylight, and that's exactly where Reed had aimed it. The lawsuit didn't sit in the background. Reed's legal team pushed it forward like they expected the records to tell the real story, because that's usually where these cases either die quietly or explode publicly. Discovery started, and the department had to produce what it had. Body cam footage, dispatch logs, supervisor notes, training records, prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, use of force reports. Anything connected to how stops and credential verification were supposed to work inside that airport. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was paperwork and video. Reed's team focused on a simple timeline. Credentials presented early, verification offered early. Crowley rejected it. Crowley escalated anyway. Moreno verified within minutes once she arrived. Hartman preserved evidence and pulled the officers. Every step lined up. The department's legal counsel saw the same problem Reed's team saw. A jury wouldn't need special training to understand what happened. A calm, compliant federal officer got forced to the floor while wearing a uniform, and the reason sounded like bias on camera. That's the kind of case that turns into a public lesson. Settlement talks began while the department tried to limit the damage. Reed didn't treat the settlement like a payout. He treated it like a lever. Money mattered because harm happened, but reforms mattered because this wasn't just about him. If the department wanted closure, it needed to change how this could happen again. The final settlement was major, big enough to sting, big enough that leadership couldn't pretend it was nuisance value. Part of the resolution included written terms tied to accountability reforms, not just a check. Then the department had to prove it was serious. Chief Hartman announced a set of changes that hit the exact failure points from the incident. Credential verification protocol. When someone presents law enforcement credentials, officers must verify through dispatch supervisor channels before escalating, unless there's a clear, immediate threat. Stop documentation requirements. Officers must document the specific basis for a stop and any escalation steps with timestamps tied to Bodycam. Duty to intervene policy enforcement. Officers who stand by during misconduct face discipline, not just coaching. Bodycam audit triggers. Certain keywords, complaint types, or use of force patterns automatically trigger a review. Supervisor response standards. A supervisor has to respond quickly when a stop involves credentials, detention, or use of force in a high-visibility public setting. Training upgrades, not feel-good lectures. Scenario-based training built around real footage and correct decision-making under stress. Crowley's outcome stayed final. He was fired, and the certification process ended his ability to hop to another department like nothing happened. That wasn't revenge. That was the system saying he couldn't be trusted with authority. Benton's outcome followed the logic the public usually misses. He didn't get treated as invisible just because Crowley was the loud one. He got disciplined for failing to intervene and for supporting the escalation. His career didn't end, but it changed. Reduced standing, restricted duties, mandatory retraining, and ongoing monitoring. The department wanted it on record that silence isn't neutral. Reed kept working. He didn't become a media personality. He didn't chase attention. He returned to duty with his reputation intact, in the only way that matters. Officially. Quietly. With proof on his side. But the personal cost didn't vanish. People underestimate that part. Being forced to the floor in public while wearing your own badge hits different. It tells you exactly how fast authority can turn on you when someone decides you don't fit the picture in their head. Still, Reed got something most people never get. A clean record of the truth and a system that couldn't erase it. That's the real takeaway here. Calm didn't protect Reed by itself. Credentials didn't protect him by themselves. What protected him was documentation, oversight, and supervisors who chose facts over loyalty. Cameras didn't create accountability, but they made it unavoidable. So here's the question for you. If you were standing there watching, would you have pulled your phone out and recorded? Or would you have kept walking and hoped someone else did it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories where evidence beats arrogance and power trips backfire, like the video and subscribe.
Stay right there. Hands where I can see him. Don't reach for anything.
Understood. Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes.
Where do you work? What agency?
City. Major crimes. You can verify me by radio.
Turn around. I'm going to pat you down.
For what reason?
Officer safety. Just do it.
Got you covered.
The two patrol officers walked up like they'd just caught a regular guy trying to slip through a traffic stop. They were wrong. The driver was a black detective sergeant in full uniform, sitting in a marked department vehicle, and the longer they kept pushing, the worse it was going to look for them. The moment he calmly identified himself, the whole stop should have ended. Instead, they kept leaning in like they didn't believe him, and after they finally let him go, their own audio picked up the part they never intended anyone to hear. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from, city and state or country. And if you like stories where people don't lose control, don't beg, and still get accountability through records and procedure, hit like and subscribe. Now, let's rewind. Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes was driving through St. Louis in a marked unit wearing full uniform. It wasn't a gray area. Anyone looking could see the vehicle belonged to the department, and the man behind the wheel belonged in it. Red and blue lights hit his mirrors. Hayes did what he'd expect from anyone he stopped. He signaled, slowed down, and pulled over safely. He kept his hands where they could be seen. No attitude, no sudden moves. He didn't try to shortcut the moment by shouting who he was from the window. He let the stop play out the way policy says it should. Two officers approached. Tyler Brennan came to the driver's side and took control of the interaction. Jared Alvarado hung back near the passenger side, angled toward the cabin, watching hands and scanning the interior. Standard posture, but not a friendly one. Brennan told Hayes the reason for the stop. The license plate didn't come back to anything. That explanation didn't make sense on its face. The unit had department plates. Even if a system was glitching, the normal response would have been quick verification and a professional reset, especially when the driver was in uniform. Instead of moving to fix the supposed issue, Brennan started asking questions that didn't match the reason for the stop. He wanted to know where Hayes was going. He asked it in a way that sounded less like routine and more like a test. Hayes answered the minimum. He gave his identity and made it clear he was Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't add extra details. He stayed focused on the stop itself. Brennan didn't accept it right away. He acted like the name didn't land. like the badge didn't land, like the uniform didn't land. Alvarado stayed in position and let Brennan run the stop, but he wasn't correcting it either. He didn't step in to say, "We've got a marked unit," or "Let's verify and clear." He just watched and waited, which told Hayes everything about how this was going to go. Hayes kept his tone even. He repeated who he was and offered what an officer would normally offer in that situation: credentials and verification. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. What made the moment tense wasn't loud voices. It was the gap between what was obvious and how they were acting. A marked police unit. A uniformed detective sergeant. Yet they were still treating him like somebody trying to talk his way out of something. Brennan pressed again with more questions about where Hayes was headed and what he was doing out there. That's the kind of line officers use when they're fishing, trying to turn a basic stop into something bigger, hoping the driver gives them a story they can poke holes in. Hayes didn't give him that. He stayed calm and shifted into a more formal, procedural tone, the kind that signals he's tracking details and thinking ahead. Brennan picked up on it. The energy changed. The stop stopped expanding and started shrinking. A quick check happened. Something got confirmed. Brennan's confidence dropped a notch. Alvarado's posture loosened just slightly. Then the stop ended, not with an apology. Not with a clean explanation for why a marked unit supposedly didn't return in the system. They simply released Hayes and stepped back like they wanted the whole interaction to disappear. Hayes drove off and kept his head straight. He didn't make a scene. He didn't pull a rank show. He didn't chase them down for an argument on the roadside. He handled it the way a detective handles something that feels wrong. He started organizing what he knew, what could be proven, and what would matter later. What Brennan and Alvarado didn't count on was the audio. They spoke after he left like the moment was over and nobody important was listening. The language they used wasn't professional frustration. It was insulting and derogatory, the kind of talk that tells you the stop wasn't just a mistake. Hayes didn't know the exact words yet. He just knew what the stop felt like, and he knew the department's systems would show whether that plate story was real. So he made a decision that was going to set everything in motion. He wasn't going to let them write the narrative first. Hayes didn't go straight into outrage. He went into process. He got back to the district, parked the unit, and sat for a minute before he even stepped out. He replayed the stop in his head, the way detectives do when they're building a timeline. The first approach, the plate claim, the questions about where he was going, the hesitation when he identified himself. None of it matched a simple system error. He did two things that night that separated this from a normal complaint. First, he wrote the basics down while it was fresh. Location, time window. Unit numbers if he caught them. The names if they said them. The exact reason they gave for the stop. He kept it plain and factual because he already knew how this game works. The second emotions show up on paper, people start labeling you angry instead of addressing what happened. Second, he started pulling what the department already had. A traffic stop isn't just two officers and a driver. It's dispatch records, CAD entries, plate queries, GPS pings, body camera status, radio traffic. Even if someone tries to explain it away later, the systems keep timestamps. By the next day, Hayes went through the formal route. He notified his supervisor and requested the stop information through the channels he was supposed to use. No threats, no, "Do you know who I am?" Just a clean report. 2 patrol officers stopped a marked unit driven by an on-duty detective sergeant, claimed the plates didn't return, questioned destination, then released him. What he expected was straightforward. Someone would look at the logs, see the problem, and handle it quietly. What he got was resistance. Not open resistance. The kind that hides behind delays and vague answers. The kind where people act like you're making them do extra work by asking for records that should be routine. Then the audio surfaced. It didn't come to him as gossip. It came the way these things always come in a department. Someone who heard it couldn't pretend they didn't hear it. A recording existed from the stop sequence, and after Hayes drove off, the officers were still talking. Their voices weren't careful anymore. The language on that audio wasn't cop stress. It wasn't a harmless complaint about paperwork or a long night. It was insulting and derogatory, aimed at Hayes, said with the confidence of people who believed they'd never face consequences for it. When Hayes listened, he didn't react like someone who wanted revenge. He reacted like someone who just received evidence. He copied the details into his notes. When he heard a name, he wrote it down. When he heard a time marker, he wrote it down. He kept it clinical. He also kept the audio secure because he understood another basic rule. The moment an incident becomes about documentation, people start trying to control what documentation exists. He reported the audio up the chain, too. That's when things shifted from uncomfortable to ugly. Instead of focusing on the officer's conduct, the conversation around Hayes started turning sideways. People didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. Why was he pushing this? Why not let it go? Why not handle it internally, quietly, without making it a thing? Hayes had heard that line before in other cases usually said to civilians. Hearing it aimed at him felt different. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for basic professional accountability for a stop that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Then the patrol officers started building their version. Brennan and Alvarado didn't just stick with, plates didn't return. Their narrative began to grow. The details started sliding in ways that protected them and put Hayes on the defensive. They hinted he acted like he didn't have to comply. They suggested he gave them attitude. They suggested he escalated the tone. They went for the classic move. If the stop looks wrong, claim the person you stopped made it difficult. The most telling part wasn't even what they claimed. It was how fast it showed up. Hayes heard through internal channels that statements were being gathered and that the framing wasn't neutral. It sounded coordinated, like they'd already agreed on what the story needed to be before anyone asked hard questions about why a marked unit didn't come back in the first place. And then came the part that crossed a line for Hayes. He started getting treated like he was under suspicion. Not formally, not with paperwork in his hand, more like a soft squeeze. Questions about his conduct. Questions about whether he was properly authorized to be in that vehicle at that time. Questions that had nothing to do with the alleged plate issue, but everything to do with flipping the spotlight. That's when Hayes stopped assuming the department would correct itself. He started thinking like a plaintiff. He began requesting the objective pieces, the plate query logs, the CAD timestamps, any Bodycam activation records, unit GPS data, and supervisor notifications. He wasn't asking for opinions. He was asking for systems that don't get nervous and don't forget. He also started looking at the oversight process, because he knew how internal handling can go when the department decides embarrassment is the real threat. The stop itself had ended quickly. The retaliation phase was just beginning. By the time Hayes realized this wasn't going to stay a simple internal complaint, the narrative had already started moving without him. Brennan and Alvarado didn't just file a short explanation and move on. They leaned into a story that made them look proactive and made Hayes look like a problem. Not criminal, just difficult. That word does a lot of work in law enforcement reports. It's a polite label that gives cover for almost anything. Their statements started circling the same points. They claimed the plate return issue was real. They suggested Hayes didn't immediately comply the way a normal driver would. And they implied his demeanor forced them to keep the stop going longer than necessary. Hayes read it and saw the angle instantly. If they could paint him as confrontational, they could justify the stop as officer safety and uncertainty. If they could imply he acted outside policy, they could make the department treat it as an internal personnel issue instead of misconduct by patrol. And then the next move came fast. Someone pushed a misconduct allegation at Hayes. It wasn't a clean, formal charge with clear evidence. It was more like an accusation wrapped in concern, questions about whether he was authorized to be in that unit, whether he was using it for personal reasons, whether he had violated some rule about where he could drive it. It didn't match reality, and Hayes knew it. He also knew why it appeared. It gave the department a reason to focus on him instead of the stop. That's the trick. Shift the topic, make it messy, make it both sides. Hayes didn't take the bait. He didn't start debating it in hallways. He didn't fire off angry texts. He treated it like any other investigation. He started building a clean timeline with hard sources. Dispatch logs mattered. Plate query records mattered. CAD timestamps mattered. GPS pings mattered. Those systems don't care who's mad at who. They just show what happened and when. When he requested those records through internal channels, the pace stayed slow. Pieces came back incomplete. Explanations came back fuzzy. System limitations. Retention schedules. We'll get it to you. That kind of talk. Hayes had been around long enough to know delay isn't always laziness. Sometimes delay is strategy, so he widened the lane. He filed a complaint that didn't rely on friendly cooperation. He moved it into the oversight process. The Police Oversight Board was supposed to be the outside valve, a place where misconduct doesn't get quietly handled by the same building that has to protect its image. Hayes submitted what he had. The basic stop details, the fact he was in full uniform in a marked unit, the plate excuse, the questioning that didn't match the reason, and the audio that captured the officer's language after the stop ended. The board's response wasn't unified. A couple members treated it like what it was, a serious indicator that something deeper was wrong. They asked for records. They asked for reports. They wanted to know why two officers would stop a marked unit and then talk like that after. Other members moved differently. They minimized. They framed it like an unfortunate exchange rather than a questionable stop. They hinted it could be handled internally, which was just another way of saying quietly. Hayes watched it happen and understood the second phase of the game. The stop wasn't only about patrol officers anymore. It was about whether oversight would actually oversee. He also understood something personal. If they were willing to imply he committed misconduct just to justify stopping him, they weren't going to stop at implying. They were going to keep pushing until he backed off or looked unstable. That's when Hayes brought in counsel. He didn't do it as a stunt. He did it because the minute your own department starts floating false allegations about you, you stop assuming good faith. You stop relying on handshake processes. You create consequences for dishonesty. Attorney Dana Whitfield met him with the same energy Hayes brought to cases, detail-focused, calm, and ruthless about documentation. She didn't start with speeches. She started with questions. What exactly was said at the stop? What did the officers claim? What proof exists outside of anyone's memory? Which systems recorded the plate check? Were body cams on? Did supervisors get notified? Who edited what report and when? Then she explained the core problem in simple terms. If Brennan and Alvarado stopped a marked unit based on a claim that couldn't be supported by system logs, that stop looked unlawful. If the questioning strayed into fishing without a legitimate basis, it looked worse. If derogatory language showed bias after the fact, it made motive harder to deny. If they coordinated statements or made inaccurate claims to justify it, that moved from bad stop into cover story. And if an oversight board failed to act properly once evidence was in front of them, they could be pulled into the case too, depending on what they did or didn't do. Hayes wasn't guessing anymore. He and Whitfield started sending formal requests and preserving evidence. Notices went out. Records requests tightened. The tone changed because legal paper changes tone. People who ignore internal emails don't ignore discovery. That's when Hayes felt the department shift again. More careful conversations, more guarded looks, less casual support. People who used to greet him like a coworker started treating him like a risk. Brennan and Alvarado also felt it. They weren't dealing with a complaint now. They were dealing with a timeline and an attorney who knew how to compare their written statements against system data. And that's when the decision became obvious. Hayes wasn't going to win this by asking for fairness. He was going to win it by forcing truth into the record. So Whitfield drafted the civil suit. It named Brennan and Alvarado directly. It laid out the stop, the alleged lack of lawful basis, the racial motive indicated by language and conduct, and the aftermath where inaccurate statements and false misconduct claims surfaced to justify what happened. It also targeted members of the Oversight Board for their role in the handling, aiming straight at accountability beyond the street-level stop. Hayes requested a jury trial and damages, not because he wanted a payday, but because he wanted the one forum where people can't bury the story in internal processes. Once it was filed, the situation stopped being gossip and started being formal. Depositions were coming, records were coming, and anyone who had helped shape the story now had to live with what they put in writing. Once the lawsuit hit, everything got real in a way internal complaints never do. People stopped speaking in vibes and start speaking in documents. Brennan and Alvarado weren't just answering a supervisor anymore. They were about to answer under oath. Whitfield moved fast and stayed narrow. She didn't argue the stop in circles. She built a timeline that either matched the systems or didn't. First came the dispatch and CAD records. Those showed whether a plate was actually run, when it was run, what it returned, and what the officers did next. Plate checks leave footprints. Even when people forget details later, the system doesn't. Then came the report history. If the officers wrote one version first and then edited it after learning Hayes had audio, that mattered. If a supervisor nudged language to make it sound cleaner, that mattered too. Not because edits are always illegal, but because coordinated cleanup looks like consciousness of guilt when the facts don't support the original claim. Body camera status got pulled next. If cameras weren't on, Whitfield didn't treat it like a mystery. She treated it like a question with a policy answer. If cameras were required and weren't activated, that's another problem. If they were activated and the stop audio existed, that's an even bigger problem for the defense. And then the audio became the anchor. Not the whole case, but the part nobody could spin. The stop ended quickly once Hayes identified himself. Yet the officers' language afterward told a different story about what they thought they were doing and why. That's what juries understand instantly. You can debate reasonable suspicion all day. It's hard to debate the mindset revealed when someone thinks the moment is private. Depositions followed. Brennan went first. He tried to hold the line. Plate didn't return. Uncertainty. Officer safety. Routine questions. Whitfield didn't bite on broad claims. She kept him pinned to specifics. What time did he run the plate? Which system? What exactly did it return? Why did he question a uniformed detective sergeant in a marked unit as if he was a stranger? Why did the story later include accusations about Hayes' behavior when the stop ended without any enforcement action? Alvarado's deposition mattered just as much, because "I was just there" doesn't work when you back a narrative. He tried to present himself as cautious and professional, but he had the same problem. His account had to match the records and had to explain why nobody verified Hayes cleanly and moved on. The retaliation piece started collapsing under that pressure. Those misconduct insinuations about Hayes, they didn't hold up when compared against duty status, vehicle authorization, and routine department practice. The false framing looked like what it was: a counter-accusation designed to make Hayes the issue. The Oversight Board got pulled in next. Some members tried to hide behind process. They suggested they deferred to internal channels, that they didn't have enough information, that timing complicated things. Whitfield didn't argue about feelings. She asked what actions were taken once evidence was presented. What was requested? What was reviewed? What was ignored? Who communicated with whom? Who delayed what? That's where the pressure shifted beyond the two patrol officers. Because even if Brennan and Alvarado started this, a system can still choose transparency or choose protection. The board's job was to be the outside check. If they acted like a shield instead, that became part of the story. Short-term consequences landed first. Brennan and Alvarado didn't keep moving like nothing happened. Their assignments changed. Supervision tightened. People inside the department got quieter around them. Not because the department suddenly found its morals, but because lawsuits create risk and risk creates control. Policy discussions started too. Plate checks, stops involving marked units, required verification steps, Bodycam activation discipline. Those conversations don't happen because leadership suddenly cares. They happen because a timeline exists and it's embarrassing. Hayes felt the blowback anyway. Some coworkers treated him like he broke an unwritten rule by making it public. Others quietly supported him but didn't want their names near it. That's common. Most people don't want to be brave when they've got bills and a job. Hayes kept doing the same thing he did at the stop. He stayed clean, no messy public statements, no social media war, no trying to be a celebrity. He let the records do the talking. As the case moved forward, the city faced a choice. Fight it at trial and risk a jury hearing the audio and seeing the contradictions, or resolve it with money and policy changes while trying to control the headline. Either way, Brennan and Alvarado couldn't outrun the core facts. They stopped a marked unit driven by a uniformed black detective sergeant using a plate excuse that didn't match how the system normally works, then spoke in a way that made bias hard to deny, then helped create a story that tried to flip misconduct onto Hayes. And Hayes couldn't unlive the lesson either. The uniform didn't protect him from being treated like a suspect. The badge didn't protect him from being doubted by people who should have known better. The only thing that protected him was discipline, documentation, staying calm, not giving them a reaction to use. That's what made the outcome bigger than one stop. It wasn't just about two officers making a bad decision on a roadway. It was about what happens when a person refuses to let the system rewrite reality. Hayes didn't win by yelling. He didn't win by threatening. He won by locking the facts in place until everyone involved had to deal with them. So, here's the question for you. If you were in Hayes' seat, would you have reported it and pushed it all the way, even knowing it could make work uncomfortable? Or would you have let it slide because it ended quickly? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've been through something like this, at work, in school, anywhere, share what happened. Somebody reading needs that. And if you want more story times where accountability actually lands, like the video subscribe and stay here,